Good afternoon and welcome everyone to our Emory Community Conversation on Unconscious Bias. My name is Marche Simpson and I am the Director of Diversity and Inclusion for Alumni Engagement within Emory Alumni Association. Emory is working to engage our community by not only the year our students became alumni or their chosen career field or industry, but also our individual identities, including race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, sexuality, religion, and all the pieces that make you you. Emory Community Conversations is a series of engagement opportunities centered on the dimensions of identity. The series will serve as a foundation for individuals in the Emory community seeking knowledge on and or looking to explore identity and its connection to racial justice, social justice, and human rights. Our goal for this programming is to activate the Emory community to be more thoughtful about what equity and inclusion looks like for marginalized identities and take an individual action in the many spaces we occupy. So join us every first Tuesday of the month as we navigate topics including, but not limited to, unconscious bias, belonging and inclusive community, the journey to allyship, and race, ethnicity, and culture. 2 pieces of housekeeping to note. This presentation is being recorded and will be sent to everyone who registered. Second, please type your questions in the question section of the platform below, and we will get to as many questions as possible following the presentation. And now, allow me to introduce our guests. Donna Troca is a Senior Associate Director at the Center for Faculty Development and Excellence. She heads up all teaching and pedagogy programs, as well as the Inclusive Pedagogy Initiative and academic learning communities. As adjunct faculty in the Institute of Liberal Arts, she teaches special topics courses in American Studies and interdisciplinary studies such as deconstructing whiteness and resisting racism, from civil rights to Black Lives Matter. Her publications include the co-edited volume of the Drag Queen Anthology and articles titled Archivist and Faculty Collaborative Course Development in Provenance, Critical Moments, a Dialogue Toward Survival and Transformation in the Caribbean Review of Gender Studies, and You Heard My Gun Cock, Female Agency and Aggression in Contemporary rap music, from African American Studies Research Perspectives. Donna has a PhD in interdisciplinary studies from Emory University, a master's in women's studies from the Ohio State University, and BA in English from University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Elena Leslie is a 2020-2021 Dean's Teaching Fellow at Emory Center for Faculty Development and Excellence, where she works in the areas of inclusive pedagogy, online teaching and learning, and course design. Elena is a PhD candidate in Emory's Department of Anthropology, studying mental health interventions among survivors in the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia. I swear I practiced that before this. Her work has been published in Ethnos, Journey of Anthropology, The Journey of Genocide Studies and Prevention, the UK literary magazine Gratna, Remembering Genocide and Necropolitics. Since first traveling to Cambodia in 2004, Elena's work in the country has been sponsored by the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, the Winter Gren Foundation, the Blakemore Foundation, a Fulbright Fellowship, and Henry Luce Foundation, among others. Before coming to Emory, she worked as a senior research specialist in the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs and as a journalist in the US and abroad. She has an MS in Global Affairs from Rutgers University and a BA in Political Science from Brown University. Thank you both for being here. Donna, Elena, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you so much, Marche. Those were ridiculously long introductions. I'm so sorry.
No
Elena and I definitely need to work on abbreviated intros.
Right.
I mean, we went back way back in time for me. Um,
in the last 20 years.
Yeah, basically, it's like, here's what I've done since I was born. So thank you so much for that. That was so great. I just want to thank all of you all for sharing your lunchtime with us on this cloudy in Atlanta Tuesday morning. And Marche, thank you so much for everything you did to pull this together. I know it's a hard time, so we appreciate your efforts in putting this together. So I'm just going to say that Elena and I are going to kind of go back and forth. We have a PowerPoint, which I'm going to put up on my screen. And we are doing this, though we have a PowerPoint, which seems does not seem casual. We are, in general, are fairly casual presenters. So we're going to have times to stop and have you all ask questions. So if you have any questions, like Marche said, you can put it in the question and answer, and we will have moments in which we can address those. And then all the resources that we refer to will be at the end of this PowerPoint, and I'll share it with Marche so you can have it. So if you're wondering, what did they say? Where was that from? You don't need to write it down. We'll provide it. Okay, so Elena, do you want me to let me share my screen really quick. Okay, so when I do that, do you see the which view are you seeing?
I can see your notes.
Okay, so let's swap displays. Okay,
that's better. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So let me just. Okay, how's that?
Good.
Agenda? Great. Okay, take it away, Elena.
Okay. Well, today we're going to be talking a bit about the concept of unconscious bias, or sometimes referred to as implicit bias. And the agenda for the presentation will be first defining bias. Then Donna is going to talk a little bit about the science of bias. We're going to talk, and I will talk a bit about that too, on the impact of bias in our spaces. And finally, different strategies that you can use to disrupt bias. The learning objectives are going to be to define the concept of unconscious bias and describe its central elements, to identify types of behavior that research suggests are linked to unconscious bias, and also describe strategies for reducing bias.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Elena. So as she said, we're going to start out with a definition of bias. This is a pretty long definition, so I'm not going to read it to you in completion, but I think I'm just going to pull out kind of the most important pieces. And I also want to let you all know that originally we're in the process, we being folks who do diversity work on campus. So I'm working primarily with Carol Henderson, the Chief Diversity Officer, to create kind of a glossary of terms of how we define things at Emory. And we worked on that, but then in the process got a new president, President Fenves. And so we're still working with him to refine those definitions. So that's why the definition I'm using is from another institution. It's from my alma mater, the Ohio State University. So bias defined. Implicit bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner, okay? And what's important to understand is that these attitudes or stereotypes that impact us are activated involuntarily, right? That's the unconscious or implicit part of it. And often it's without your awareness, right? So it's not something that's kind of at the front of your brain. It's something that actually, we'll talk a little bit about where in the brain it actually resides, but it's things that, the way I describe it, kind of pop up at the back of your brain and you're not even sure how they got there. So it's in the subconscious, because it's in the subconscious and it's unconscious, you can't just kind of access it through introspection. I think the other thing that's important to understand is that oftentimes these associations that we harbor in our subconscious can cause us to have feelings or attitudes about other people based on characteristics such as race, ethnicity, age, appearance, right? And I think this is the most important part of it, is that where these come from is through our socialization, education. So what they're calling here is direct and indirect messages. The way in which folks were talked about in our families, in our schools, in our cultures, in our countries, right? And so in this definition also, they talk about the importance of kind of the media and news programming as well, right? So I see that as part of our kind of socialization and also education. Okay, so that's what we mean when we're talking about bias. It's a long definition, but hopefully you get the gist of it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. And again, y'all, we are together for, now less than an hour. So this is a pretty quick overall discussion. So if you want to talk more about this offline, Elena and I are happy to do that. So the work that we're talking about, this where unconscious bias resides, is in a part of the brain called the amygdala, right? So this is also understood as like the reptilian brain. And so this part of our brain, what it's utilized for is it helps us to categorize. I mean, our brains in general help us to categorize, right? And so when we're met with someone new, we are immediately going to try and categorize them. This is what the work our brain is doing. And so what we know from research done on this part of the brain is that that we gravitate toward likeness. So when we meet someone, we immediately categorize, are they like me or are they not like me? And because we are all folks with intersectional identities, that could mean, you know, someone could be like you in one way and not like you in another way. But just understand that oftentimes that we gravitate toward likeness. If they are unlike you, what our brain has taught us is that you need to proceed with caution, right? So this part of the brain is also the fight or flight brain part of the brain that, I mean, originally was used to keep us alive. So you take in the data of the people that you're seeing. Are they like me? Are they not like me? Should I proceed with caution? Should I not? And also you're going to connect that to data like something that you already have, right? So Elena's from Oregon. I met her and I might say, oh, right, because she reminds me of this other person I know from Oregon. That's kind of a silly example, but you get the sense of how we're hooking it back to things that we already know. And that also our brain uses these kind of shortcuts, right? Oh, she's that, so she must be this, or he's that, he must be this. And so that's the place where we can see prejudices come in, or these biases come in. Okay, so that is like a total drive-by understanding of the science of bias. All right, I'm going to stop sharing. Well, I guess I can't really see the people, so I'm not going to stop sharing. What questions do you have? Hopefully, Elena, you can see the questions.
Yeah, I'm
Okay.
opening the chat here.
Okay.
And I want to say, if people would like to type their questions in the chat, you're welcome to do that. I don't know if people have the ability to just speak out.
I bet they don't, because it's webinar.
Oh, okay. And also, I was just going to point out that one of the interesting things about this idea of unconscious bias is that, as Donna was sort of describing, we often think of bias in a negative respect, but bias can also be positive. And that's also something to think about, is like, are you sometimes sort of unfairly giving people the benefit of the doubt, or unfairly giving people advantages because you have a positive bias toward them that you're not really aware of?
That's a great point. I had a meeting before this with a faculty developer from Loyola in Chicago. And I wasn't sure if it was Loyola in Chicago or Loyola in California. And when I said it, she said it was Loyola in Chicago. I said, oh, well, of course I'll help you if you're from Chicago.
Right.
Because that's where I'm from. I said, I'm showing my Illinois bias. Okay, do we have any questions?
So far, we don't have any questions.
Okay, let's move on then.
Okay.
And maybe the more information we give them, the more folks will have questions.
Oh,
Okay,
wait,
so,
someone.
Oh,
Okay. If you were raised being cautious against being biased, Jewel Taylor wants to know, is it possible you don't have bias?
that's a great question. I think, and Elena, I'd love for you to weigh in on this as well, but my guess would be being raised is just one part of it, right? So like I'm raising a almost 6-year-old little boy right now, and I'm trying to raise him to be conscious, or to think about bias, and to talk about identity and power and difference. But that's not the only place he's learning. Okay, he's also in school. He also goes to his grandparents. He also watches TV. Once he knows how to read, he'll be reading books. So I think, unless all of those places are doing that work, which if they are, awesome. I can't imagine that, but that sounds great. I think it'd be hard, right? Because I think there's multiple layers to that. What do you think, Elena?
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with that, because I think I was raised in an environment too, where there, you know, my parents and a lot of the educators I had and stuff like that tried very hard to work against bias. But I think because we are embedded in a larger society that has certain power structures already at play, that that everyone is programmed to a certain extent to have certain biases.
Does that answer the question?
Yeah, she wrote, great answer. Parents are not the only influencers. Yeah, absolutely.
Sadly, we have to release our children to other people. Or actually not sadly, because I've been with my kid for the last 8 months. Love him, but have had a lot of him. Okay, so let's talk.
We have one other question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, how can you share with people that you think their unconscious bias is affecting the way they do X, if the person believes they do not have bias because they do not see color?
Can we, I would say, I think we should hold on to that.
Okay.
I feel like we're going to address some of that
In the strategies?
in the strategies. If when we get to the strategies, person who asked that question, if we don't kind of crack the nut the way you want us to, ask it again and we'll bring it up then. Okay. I think let's talk. I just want to talk a little bit first about the impact before we start like fixing the problem. Okay. So here is my sad picture about unconscious bias. Is the only thing I could find on Creative Commons, but let's talk a little bit about the impact of bias. Okay. And I just want to make sure I'm not, yeah. Okay. So we're going to talk about it in three. So what's tricky about this is Elena and I are we do faculty development. So we mostly work with faculty. And when we talk about unconscious bias with faculty, often we're talking about it around hiring, maybe in the classroom, maybe in committee work. But this is a larger audience. We weren't entirely sure everybody who's going to be watching. So we tried to diversify in some ways the places that we're talking about bias. So right now, I'm going to start off with the kind of work that we do normally and talk a little bit about how bias it can impact hiring. And this could be hiring in an academic institution. It could also be hiring in any kind of organization or corporation. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is a research project. It's often called the kind of Greg, Jamal, or Emily, Lakisha effect, okay? And so in this project, what we saw, or I don't know how, yeah, let's just call it a project. What the folks did is they sent out identical resumes to both a Boston and Chicago labor market. And the only thing that was different, exactly the same resumes, is the first name was Greg, or the first name was Jamal, or in the case of women, the first name was Emily, the first name was Lakisha. And the reason why they chose these names is they understood, the researchers understood this as white sounding names, Greg and Emily as white sounding names, and Jamal and Lakisha as black sounding names. So the only thing that was different was the names. Okay, great. And what they found was that when Greg had a criminal record, so they made a few shifts, right? And when they found that Greg with a criminal record received more callbacks, he received 17%, than Jamal without a criminal record, right? So the idea is that there's something happening with the people who are reading these resumes that based only on name and kind of the biases they connect to that name, that made these jobs more accessible to Greg, even when he had a criminal record, than to Jamal when he didn't. Okay, and this, again, you'll get these PowerPoint slides, so you can look more into this article from the American Economic Review. Okay, another place that we see it is in letters of recommendation. Another study done in 2016, and this was for a highly selective postdoctoral fellowship in geoscience, okay? And what they did is they asked people they looked at letters of male applicants and they looked at letters of female applicants. And what they found is that, I mean, all the letters were shining in some ways, right? I mean, these were kind of the best of the best, but they found that the letters for the male applicants were longer and they used stronger language. So the female applicants' letters were shorter. They were solid letters, but they didn't set the applicant apart, right? So the language they would use for the male applicants were things like that he is a brilliant scientist, he is a trailblazer. And for women, what they're calling kind of lukewarm language. She's knowledgeable, she's highly intelligent, but she's not set apart. That's the person you want, right? The trailblazer, the brilliant scientist. So again, there's ways in which, male names and female names, or the ways in which gender can really impact how we recommend people, right? How that bias can come in. And I imagine, I mean, I know enough about this research that I've looked back at letters, and now I think moving forward, I think about the letters I'm writing for my students and like, what is the language I'm using, and how can I make sure that I'm not letting that kind of unconscious bias creep into my recommendations. Okay, I just want to make sure.
I was just going to say, Donna,
Yes.
that oftentimes too, that women are described as being like very detail oriented and diligent. So it sort of portrays an image of like, she's a good workhorse, she can follow directions, but not really a visionary, you know.
Right, and she'd be great to like do all that behind the scenes work, right? But not maybe at the front of the work. Okay, so let's talk. I just want to talk a little bit about some real world effects. Okay, I'm actually just going to put all these up so that I don't have to focus on. Oops, sorry. Okay, so When we do this not online or maybe not with such a large group, we usually show a video. The link to it is at the end of the PowerPoint slide from the New York Times that's about bias. And what they did in that research study is that they wrote letters, or they wrote emails, not letters. They wrote emails to 4,500 professors at different universities across the US. And they pretended like they were someone who wanted to be a graduate student. So they were writing to ask about the department, right? Dear Professor Leslie, I'd love to know more about the anthropology department. Could you please let me know? And they signed those emails with different names, names that they understood that they were calling white, black. They said Chinese, so Asian, South Asian, Indian, and Latino or Latinx. And what they found is that the white male sounding names got more responses to the emails than all the other groups put together. So why this is important, as anyone who's gone through the university, is that who's helping you can really make a difference, right? So if I hear back from the chair of the department, that's going to help me know more about that department, and it's also putting me in the mind of that chair, right? So when they're doing admissions, they might remember my name. But if someone doesn't write back to me, I don't get that kind of access, right? So again, it's a way in which it can impact who gets callbacks or who gets responses. Awkward body language is really important. It can influence hiring and recruiting. And the way in which this is tied to bias is oftentimes we read anything that's kind of not clear to us, or that what seems to be awkward, as negative, right? And it's important to understand that people respond, or people act differently in social situations. Some people don't make eye contact. Some people may not be comfortable shaking hands. And this could just be who they are, kind of their temperament, but also a lot of folks who are on the spectrum, folks who are autistic or have Asperger's, may not interact socially in the way that you are used to, right? And so that means that those people are not going to get the job because of something that you understood as awkward, when actually it's just that their brain works differently than yours does. How we read facial expressions is important too. A lot of times, again, if you have kind of a blank slate, right? You're not smiling, you're not sad, you're just kind of looking. For me, it's my kind of thinking face is a lot of times understood as negative. So we've got to think about the kind of biases we have about why weren't they smiling? Does it matter if a woman isn't smiling? Does that mean something different than if a man isn't smiling? Those kinds of things. And then also this more negative evaluations when women are described as confident, aggressive, or ambitious, right? Those are terms that are used negatively for women, but those are characteristics for men that are seen as valuable, right? So if you explain someone as she was really confident in her job talk, right? That might mean something different than if you say a male applicant was confident in his job talk, right? That could be seen as positive. So again, just thinking about how our biases in these kinds of situations can really impact who has access to resources, who has access to jobs, and who is read as kind of valuable to an organization or not. Okay, this is going to be Elena.
Sure. Well, I was going to talk a little bit about K through 12 education, because as Donna said, we weren't exactly sure who was going to be attending this webinar, and we usually talk to faculty, but I thought that K through 12 education is another space that a lot of people are actively involved in. Either you work in K through 12 education, or you might have a child who is in K through 12 education. So these are important things to think about in these spaces. Sorry, I just need to open my notes here. So there are a number of different ways that implicit bias or unconscious bias can play a role in the K-12 environment. It could be in terms of academic evaluation, discipline, which is very important, screening for disability support, and admission into talented and gifted programs. And I put down here also this idea of the school to prison pipeline. This is a general idea that in certain underperforming schools or certain groups of people in underperforming schools are more sort of consistently targeted for disciplinary intervention that then becomes a pattern that can unfortunately be reinforcing throughout the life cycle. And one interesting article that I was reading was actually from the American Bar Association. Oops, I did not mean to just send that out. From the American Bar Association, and it was about the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision, and some of the sort of unanticipated effects that that has had over the decades. And one of the unanticipated effects was that before, when schools were segregated, before the desegregation movement began, oftentimes Black students were taught by Black educators. And then with the elimination of a lot of schools and the merging of student populations, oftentimes those educators lost their jobs. And then it would be mostly white middle-class educators who were teaching more diverse populations of students, who they might not necessarily understand in the same way and might have implicit biases about, or maybe would misinterpret different behavior that the students had. And I thought that was interesting in terms of thinking about like the long-term implications of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Let's see, in terms of disciplinary actions, in a 2012 study, it was found that 17%, or 1 out of every 6 Black school children involved in enrolled in K through 12 education were suspended at least once, compared to 1 in 20 for whites. Also then, in terms of academic evaluation, a 2017 study found that math teachers perceive their classes to be too difficult for Latino and Black students, and English teachers perceive their classes to be too difficult for all non-white students. And in terms of screening for either disability support or talented and gifted programs, this can also be an issue because oftentimes teachers are the ones who are on the front line in making these decisions about who is actually going to be screened for these kinds of additional services. And a January 2016 article by the American Educational Research Association found that Black and Latino school children are less likely to be screened for gifted programs in public schools than white and Asian school children. So this can, as Donna and I have discussed before, this can begin a process of sort of tracking that starts at a very early age, where students are not getting into the talented and gifted programs. And then this amplifies over time in terms of the kinds of opportunities that are available to them in the academic environment. If you go first from, being sort of on the non-gifted track in elementary school, and then into middle school, and then into high school, and then it's going to eventually impact even the kind of colleges you can apply to, and the kind of scholarships you can get, and all those kinds of things.
And if I can just jump in for a second about this, I think what's important that Elena's pointing out here, especially around, say, the gifted, and this is not only about the teachers, right? I think it's about the way in which the bias the teachers have, but also the bias of the curriculum. So there's a lot of times where if a kid's not going to be engaged in a curriculum if they don't see themselves represented, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether that means that it's a science curriculum that shows girls that, they see no women scientists. They don't hear about, they don't learn about. To them, science is just something that men do. Or if it's a almost entirely white curriculum, right? And you're a student of color. And if you're only learning about the history of white people and you don't see yourself reflected, you might be less engaged, right? So I think that it's on kind of like both sides of the desk, right? Not only that we have to make sure that we're talking to teachers to make sure that they're thinking broadly about what gifted means and what gifted looks like, but also how we're teaching our students, what curriculum we're using to make sure that it's got a diverse representation of people as, leaders, scholars, engineers, those kinds of things, so that kids are seeing themselves reflected in that.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And right now there's been a big movement in the university environment to sort of decanonize a number of syllabi, is the idea, to bring in more diverse voices and to rethink basically what the foundational canon is. And I imagine that this is being done to some extent in different K through 12 environments as well, but that's also something to think about, is how you might actually vary the instructional approach and the kinds of materials being used.
Great.
And then I also wanted to think about other spaces that might be important to people where implicit bias could potentially have an impact. And one thing that came to mind was religious spaces, because these are things that are not directly related to work or education, but they can nonetheless have a big impact on people's lives and the kinds of resources that they're tapped into. And one interesting thing I found, if you look back at the studies that Donna has already talked about in terms of the emails that were sent out for a job or sort of postdoc applications, and the kinds of names that were chosen and then the responses. A similar study was actually done by a sociologist at the University of Connecticut in terms of looking at Christian churches. And the professor and his research team actually sent out 3,000 emails to congregations, basically from people who were supposedly moving into a new town and who wanted to become connected with the church. And they varied these emails in terms of the names that they used. And some of the names were white sounding names, some were Black, Hispanic, or Asian. And in this particular study, although they didn't find a big difference in the response rates for the evangelical and Catholic churches that they sent the emails to, they did have a significant difference in the response rate from mainline Christian churches. So that's something to think about going forward too, is that this can be another way in which, and we don't have the background information, we don't know exactly why people didn't respond to the emails, but the assumption is that there may have been some implicit bias based on the names of the people who were associated with these sort of test emails. So in terms of a summary of this section of the presentation on the impact of bias, these kinds of implicit biases, as Donna and I both said, are pervasive. Everyone has them. We think, that people have them even if they try hard to be conscious of the biases that they have. And that as in the example of children, even if you're trying to raise your child in an environment with very few biases, they're exposed to the broader society. And so there's only so much that you can do about that and control that. The biases that people have don't necessarily correspond with their declared beliefs. So we may hold, that's why it's the whole idea of unconscious bias, is we may not think that we're biased, but still there is some sort of unconscious programming that's going on there in terms of who we decide to help or not help or respond to. And I think this especially comes up in situations where we're pressed for time and, it's things like job applications and responding to potential PhD students and all those kinds of things. Oftentimes people don't have a lot of time, and we're all very busy. And so you're kind of doing those mental shortcuts most of the time. These biases tend to favor our own in-group, and they can be activated in a new relationship or ambiguous situations. And also they are malleable. So they're something that we can work on.
Okay, great. So we've talked a little bit then about what we mean by bias, the definition. Very quickly, we talked about the science of it. And then here we've talked about the impact in a couple different environments. So what questions do you have about that so far? And I'm sorry, Elena, I'm gonna have to lean on you again because I can't see.
I just want to say there are a couple comments in the chat.
Okay, great.
Okay. So Sonia Parazuna wrote that profiling and screening applications is widely common. You see this in jobs, school applications, board memberships, housing, etc. So I think that ties into everything we've been saying, and that you can think about it in the workplace, in academic environments, but also can be true in even emails to religious organizations or other sort of civic organizations that we might be involved with.
Great.
And then also exactly, representation matters. It's subtle, but so important. Dr. Beverly Tatum, PhD, wrote a book called Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria that addresses this.
Yeah, that's great. For a second, I thought you were saying Dr. Beverly Tatum was on this call, and I almost threw up. I was like, oh my God.
Oh no.
Read her book. It's great.
Yeah.
Okay, anything else?
Yes, there's a question. Is there any work relative to the field of epigenetics to understand our full range of biases?
Oh gosh, that's a great question.
That is a great question.
I'm not sure I have the answer. So
Right.
because of time, I'm going to say I'm not sure, but I'd be happy if we're going to give you our emails at the end. I'd be happy to have an offline conversation with you about that. And then when we do find some useful resources on that, then I can give it to Marche and she can circulate it. And or maybe we have like an epigeneticist that's hard to say, on the webinar right now, and they can chime in as we go along.
That would be awesome.
Yeah,
if we
yeah,
could
I
have a
mean-
geneticist on the call.
I know. I mean, it's possible, right? I mean, there could be someone that's an alum of Emory that does that. Okay, anything else?
Yeah, Marche had a couple questions actually.
Okay, great.
She wanted to know, was there a difference between letters written by males versus women, females? And also, do you know if there is a bias against bilingualism in this space?
Meaning bilingualism, just in person-to-person relationships, or someone saying they're bilingual on a resume?
Yeah, Marche, if we could get some more clarification on that, that would be great.
And to answer the first question, I think if I'm correct, if I'm remembering correctly, I don't think there was difference, right? I don't think there was difference between letters that, and let me also just say that we're using these binaries of like male and female, and I'm well aware that there are people who don't fit into those binaries, but unfortunately, much of the research isn't. Okay, so just I want to kind of give a little shout out to that. But I think that there wasn't much difference between letters written by, say, like if you're writing a letter for students, so male professors and female professors. And so again, I think there's a way in which that reiterates that even when we're kind of like working against our own in-group, right? So like for me as a woman writing a letter of recommendation for a female student, if I'm still like kind of replicating these biases, I'm doing damage to someone who's in the same group as me. And part of that is because that is culturally, that is what I was exposed to, right? These are the ways we talk about women. These are the ways we talk about men. These are positive aspects for women. These are positive aspects for men. So I have kind of, absorbed that. Even if I'm trying to work against it, there's a way in which my brain has absorbed it. So again, we said there at the end that these things are malleable. You have to constantly be working at it, right? So write the letter when I'm, in a rush, right? I've got 30 minutes between my next meeting. I'm going to write this recommendation letter, right? Then wait, go to the meeting, come back, and then go look through. How did I describe her, right? That's the work, right? That's the kind of like debiasing or taking kind of an audit of the way in which I'm describing her or him or the student to make sure that I'm not kind of maintaining some of these tropes that can be damaging to the person.
Yeah. And so in terms of this question of bilingualism, Marche was asking about person to person, and then another audience member asked about bilingualism in K through 12. I mean, what I can say about my personal experience with dealing with students who might not be native English speakers is that I do think that it works against them. And that I think that I try to be very careful, and I know some professors who are more and less careful about this. I don't think that usually the idea of knowing another language is the problem. I think that some lack of proficiency in English can be sort of doubly or triply counted against people in grading and those kinds of things. And so sometimes I try very hard, if I know that someone is an international student or a non-native English speaker, to take that into consideration and to really try to take off, maybe I'll just take off 1 point for all the grammatical errors and that sort of thing in the essay, and then focus more on the ideas and try to sort of tease those out, as opposed to just focusing on the fact that there are grammatical or typographical errors.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of Gerald Wing Sue is one of the leading writers about microaggressions, and he talks about a category of like forever foreignness, right? This idea of like, where are you from? No, where are you really from? That kind of stuff. So I think that oftentimes English language learners are understood as kind of foreign, and therefore would be understood as more work, right? I mean, a lot of this, what your brain is doing is it's kind of trying to sort of protect you and your time. So what may be happening in the brain then is like, if you see someone who you might think, oh, well, that's going to take a little bit of extra work, right? I mean, as far as like in the K through 12, and this is not based on research, it's based anecdotally, I do see the ways in which students that are English language learners, where English is not the first language spoken at home, I think they do have to navigate things that are more difficult than students where English is their first language, and that is what's spoken at home, right? So everything that comes from the administration, if it's not translated into the language that your parents speak, that means either the child has to do that translation or you just miss out, right? I mean, this is something that I've been working. My son's his school is fairly diverse, and I realized that we were getting all these flyers that are only in English, and I was like, what about the people who don't speak English? And so now everything's in multiple languages. So yeah, I don't think it's like I would actually argue in this moment, as we move towards a much more diverse demographic in the United States, being someone who speaks multiple languages works for you. But again, I'm thinking we still live in a country where the systems aren't necessarily built for that, right? That it's not seen always as kind of a positive instead of a negative. Okay, let's we're a little bit over. Oh no, we got 20 minutes. Okay, let's move on to what we can do. Okay, so what can we do? And we're going to split this, right? I think, Elena.
Yes.
Okay, so all right, so there's a lot of things we can do, but the 3 we're going to talk about today, and the first 2 are going to be kind of a quick, and then we're really going to focus on the third. But there is a lot of research on bias. So, looking at kind of which parts of our brains are activated when met with something that when we're thinking like when bias is in play, right? So, you could ostensibly go get an fMRI. Most people can't, but just I want you to know that there are ways that there is research, and there continues to be research to really think about how the brain works, and ways to kind of short circuit those processes so that we can move towards less bias. But I don't think that most people are going to be able to do that. The second is, and maybe some of you have heard about this, there's a test called the IAT test, or the implicit association test. This is a test that was created at Harvard many, many years ago, and it's kind of had revisions. A lot. You can just Google it and you'll find it. It's free, anyone to use. And what it really does is exactly what it says. It kind of measures the ways in which your brain associates certain things with certain words, certain representations, how 2 ideas are connected. So what it does is it gives you images and it gives you words, and it asks you use like 2 keys on the keyboard that don't really make sense. And you have to just say, good goes with white or good goes with black, and you'll see an image that kind of primes your brain to make those connections. And you have to do it as quickly as possible, right? So it's that time crunch, again, that we talked about, whether it's looking at applications or, for housing or for a job. The time crunch is what's supposed to make your brain just like, this is what I think, this is what I think, this is what I think. So if you're interested in bias and maybe finding out what biases you hold, this is one place you can go to, is the IAT test. And they have tests for lots of different identity categories: race, gender, sexuality, nationality, body size, disability, all kinds of things. So it's, if you've got free time, say over the holidays, maybe you could take a couple of those. And then now we want to talk, this is kind of like the part that getting to answer that earlier question. So what are some strategies that we can use to disrupt biases? And I think, Elena, you're going to do these, right?
Yes.
It's slow release. Okay, here we go.
Right, exactly. Animation.
Okay, so.
So one strategy is to mask the race, gender, or other social identity characteristics of applicants, if that's possible, whether this is applicants for an academic position or for jobs, or as we mentioned, for different kinds of civic organizations. And we have here the example of Symphony Orchestra auditions. This was this was a study that was actually done by 2 economists, and they found that, and it was actually 2 female economists, they found that in screened symphony orchestra auditions, if the people auditioned behind a screen and it was not clear what their sort of demographic profile was, or if they were women or men, that women actually were selected more frequently than they were in the non-screened auditions. You can commit in advance to specific merit criteria and rank order their importance before reviewing applications, and be wary of ideas of sort of fit, chemistry, and collegiality as criteria. I was joking with Donna that fit is like one of the most vague descriptions ever of why someone does or doesn't get a position. That's like, oh, you weren't the right fit. Kind of means like, in our subjective opinion, we just didn't like you or did like you.
Right. And oftentimes that fit means like, you're like us.
Right?
Yeah. So
we went to the same schools.
Or everybody, you're extroverted like me and I like that. Yeah. So, exactly. That's not a reason to hire someone.
Reduce time pressure and distraction during evaluation processes. Allow time for reflective rather than reflexive decisions. Now, this is difficult for all of us, right? And I think this is, as I said, I think this is one of the main ways that bias comes into our lives, even if we're trying not to be biased, is the fact that we're always just under time pressure. And so we're trying to make fast judgments. And so I liked the strategy that Donna mentioned before about, for example, just try to put things aside and then come back and revisit them, so you can do a bit of an audit before you send out that letter of recommendation or anything else that you're working on. Use structured interviews with standardized questions rather than unstructured conversation in things like job interviews. And think about whether you've given everyone the same consideration of context and circumstances. Ask for specific feedback tied to the merit criteria. Discount vague assessments of candidates.
Right. And again, this is the kind of not just like, so don't ask, so what did you all think about her? Or what did you think about him? But instead say, how did you feel do you feel like they were qualified in the area of diversity and equity to meet the needs of this position? Because then you're asking about what their qualifications are and their experiences, not just whether or not you thought they smiled enough.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Consciously strive to increase the representation of women of all races and people of color of all genders where you work. So make that sort of a conscious goal. Discuss implicit biases and strive to minimize their influence on evaluations and judgments. So this is something that you can try to be transparent about. As we said before, this idea that we're all programmed with certain biases, and so we don't need to immediately get defensive if someone brings it up. Try to have open conversations about these things.
And try to do that proactively rather than reactively. So have that discussion with your congregation. If you're getting an influx of new people into your church or into your synagogue, try to have that conversation with your teachers if you're an administrator, so that it's not reactive, but instead they're thinking about it as they move forward.
Yeah, because it's oftentimes too in a reactive situation that people are more likely to feel defensive. Like, well, I didn't mean it that way.
Right.
Spend sufficient time evaluating each person or situation. Don't rush the process. Once again, this is difficult, but we have to try to do the best we can. Be intentional. Don't assume you know, and ask open-ended questions. Empower each other to help each other. Have other people feel empowered to call you out on your biases. This has to do with the transparency. Sorry.
Right. And it's hard to do, especially like I'm thinking, again, because of where we work, if you're in a committee meeting looking to, hire someone, and you're an assistant professor and the person running the committee is the chair of the department, right? It may be difficult to say, wait, I'm not sure we can actually ask them that question. But again, if you're trying to create a bias-free and as the most kind of neutral situation for that hiring committee, you need to be able to find a way. So maybe that means you say something to them after the meeting, and not in front of everybody, but still there's a way. You have to make sure that you create that kind of environment of accountability, no matter what the group is, the goal of the group.
We do have some questions too.
Okay, great. That's it for our slides. So let's just open it up to discussion. I'm going to stop.
And I thought, interestingly, one of the audience members wrote, "Establish trust" in all capital letters. I think it's important,
Yeah, I'm just going to show this for a second in case you have questions, but I want us to have a larger discussion, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So Donna Troca and Elena Leslie. Okay, great.
Sure.
So what do we have here?
Oh, okay. Actually, I realized that we have questions in the chat and the Q&A. I didn't realize these were two different.
Okay, so which were you looking at, chat or Q&A?
I had been looking at the chat.
Okay, so
and so then also in the Q&A, one attendee wants to know, what advice do you have for volunteers that are working in communities that they are not a part of for combating bias? For example, volunteers from North Fulton County volunteering in low-income schools in South Fulton.
So what, say the beginning of it again?
Sorry. What advice do you have for volunteers that are working in communities that they are not a part of for combating bias?
Well, I mean, I think anytime that you're working in a community, you should be building relationships and partnerships with people that are in that community. So I think that's, I would just say like at the get-go. So if, I mean, I don't know exactly what the specific context is, but talking to them about getting a sense of how they do things. And then, if you can, in a way that doesn't seem like you're taking over, just say, I'm really, I'm noticing how people keep misgendering a couple students. And I just want to make sure that we're having discussions around that. So do you all have any training around that? And if not, I'd be happy to find, to put together a conversation that we could have, right? So one is not kind of coming in and taking over. And then two, a willingness to show that you're willing to work to help that community think through their biases in a way that doesn't seem threatening and isn't onerous to them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And then let's see, we have another question. I like the idea of masking race and gender in applicants for jobs, but we are also supposed to be seeking diverse candidates, which can sometimes be surmised by seeing someone's name or looking them up online. How do we accomplish both seeking diversity and dealing with bias? I think that's a great question, actually.
Yeah. I mean, that is true. Like, I feel like between Google and Facebook, you can learn a lot about a person, right? Well, Elena, do you have ideas?
I think it would depend on sort of each hiring committee, and what the goals are in terms of that committee. Because yeah, I mean, I think those are two different strategies that you can use, and you can't mask all of the race and gender and all these things of the applicants, and then at the same time also be specifically trying to seek diverse applicants. So I think that it would probably be a conversation that you would need to have in that individual hiring committee in terms of what your goals are.
Yeah, and I think it would be probably more than one conversation, right? So I mean, I think you'd have to have a conversation with the group. Okay, folks, so this is what we're looking for. We're looking for someone with these competencies. We're hoping to meet these goals. We want them to run these programs. We're also looking to diversify our department based on race and gender and disability. I'm just making this up. So I just want all those things kind of on your shoulder as you're reading it. But then also, I think each individual, I mean, I'm going through a hiring committee right now, and each person, there's things I'm drawn to them, and I'm like, am I drawn to them because they're going to be the best person for this job, or am I drawn to them because they're like me? Whether it's like they're an academic or they're a white woman or whatever. Do you know what I mean? So it's this kind of like larger conversation, I think, and then also like a personal reflection, again, thinking about and being very clear about the expectations. We want X, Y, and Z, and who gives us X, Y, and Z. But then you also have to think about, not everybody has the access. Not everybody has equal access, right? So if you're a university that only values other people who come from Ivy League universities, right? You're leaving out all these folks who went to state schools, right? And some people went to state schools because they wanted to go to state schools. I went to state schools. But some people went to state schools because they couldn't afford Ivy League schools, right? So just thinking, I mean, you've got to be thinking of this kind of like longer historical trajectory and how, when you think about like pipelines and why they get leaky. So it's kind of like, I think it would be some kind of multimodal approach.
Yeah, I also wonder if you could sort of divide it into a multi-stage process somehow. You know what I mean? Like in one stage of the application reviews, you do or don't mask these qualities of the applicants, and in another stage, you have those available. Or if you divide the committee even into different groups, and one group works with sort of the de-identified applicants and the other group doesn't. Or like I said, or you either don't have that information available at first, or you bring that information into play later on. I don't know.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Let's see. Also, what's your advice for rectifying a wrong once you realize that you have said or done something wrong or offensive?
I mean, I think, okay, so I think that for most humans, when you've done something wrong, whether it's whether you said something offensive or you've misgendered someone, your immediate response is, this happened. I've recently cut my hair once COVID started because I can't deal with it. So if I'm wearing a hoodie or something, I'm getting called sir a lot more, right? And it doesn't even faze me, right? But when someone calls me sir, and then I get to the thing and they look at, they realize my name's Donna or whatever, And then there are really effusive, I'm so sorry, right? So that is because you feel like you've done something wrong. And there are people who would be upset about being misgendered. I'm not one of them, right? So I think instead, if someone corrects you on something, rather than apologizing, because then what's the expectation if you say, I'm sorry? Your expectation is they'll say, it's okay, right? Instead, just saying, thank you for correcting me on that, right? In that situation, I guess they're not in all situations though would you be corrected. It would be more that you said something and then you realize it on your own that you said it. Is that how you would read it, Elena?
Yeah, no, I like that idea.
So, I mean, I guess the point is that you don't want to dwell so much on, I just screwed up and I want you to make me feel better, but instead, I just screwed up. I'm sorry I screwed up and I'm going to work on not doing that again, right? So, I mean, when I teach at the beginning of classes, I ask my students everybody what pronouns they want, and I ask them to help me with pronunciations of name. And I say, I'm going to screw this up, but I'm going to work on it. So I just ask for you to give me some grace, but like also like this is my job, not yours, right? So I think, yeah, I'm not sure I'm answering that very well, but
yeah, I like the idea of thanking people as well. And like you said, to sort of shift the focus and not make it about wanting them to make you feel better,
Right. Like, thank you for your grace. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see, we have another question here. What recommendations do you have to help ourselves be prepared to be receptive to feedback about our bias? Since our instinct would be to push back on any call out, it would take some advanced preparation to be receptive when the time comes. Suggestions.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, right? I mean, the same part of your brain we were talking about that does the bias is the same, you know what I mean? It's like, gives you that same sort of like, oh, I did something wrong. Oh, they're going to think I'm racist, or, oh, they're going to think I don't know what I'm talking about. So I think that this is I guess for me, it's a lifelong journey. You know what I mean? So I don't have like just take this pill and eat 2 apples and it'll be fixed, right? I think instead it's just, if someone gives you feedback, I think if you can say, thank them and say, I'm going to think about that. Because I think oftentimes if someone calls you on something and you'll say, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm not sure that you've actually really kind of metabolized what they've said or even like thought through what it means. And I think that that's a bigger process. So I think you have to do some kind of like internal kind of like reflective work to realize like, okay, what did I do there? Like how could I have done that different? And let's say, if, someone calls me out on something, from a group that I'm not a part of, right? Let's say it's a person of color, and they say something I said was racist, right? It's not my job to then go to all my friends of color and be like, yo, listen, someone called me racist and I don't really get it. Can you help me out? Right? It's my job to do the work, and also maybe talk to other white people and be like, listen to what just happened to me. What do you think about that? Do you have any ideas? Right? Like, I think that there's a way in which, again, if you've done damage to a group, it's not that group's job to like educate you on why you did damage. Does that make sense? What do you think, Elena?
Yeah, no, definitely. Because people already in sort of underrepresented groups already have to do so much of this kind of emotional labor. So I think it would, be best not to do that if you can, and not say, oh, yeah, well, what do you think about this? I mean, you're Black, so
yeah,
is this offensive?
Yeah.
And then we'd be like, well, I can't really speak for everyone,
Okay, Marche is telling us to wrap it up. I don't know if I couldn't get to the question and answer for some reason, but did we answer those questions?
We did almost all of them.
Okay, cool.
Yes, thank you so much, Donna and Elena. This was a wonderful experience. As a lifetime learner, I have so many notes on my page. So thank you so much. And for everyone who joined us, thank you for joining us for this important conversation. If you would like to continue this conversation through small group dialogue, you should join us on Emory Civic Dinners, which is civicdinners.com/Emory. And we will also have another conversation on Tuesday, December 1st on belonging and inclusive community with Emory's Belonging and Community Justice Working Group. Thank you all again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Great. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.